The barrel of the 45 felt cold against Malphas Vane's temple, the only honest thing he'd touched in years. Every street in this city was paved with the bones of people who had crossed him, and at 35, the man they called the Hollow King had finally run out of enemies to kill and sins to bury. The rain in Central Park didn't wash anything away. It only made the blood on his hands feel heavier. Malphas closed his eyes, ready for the silence, ready for the nothingness. But then, a small, wet hand tugged at his expensive wool sleeve. He didn't see a hitman. He didn't see a ghost. He saw a toddler in a mud-stained jacket, holding out a single dying marigold. The petals were brown, the stem was snapped, and it was the most beautiful thing Malphas Vane had ever seen. If this story doesn't change the way you look at the world, nothing will. Hit that like button if you believe even the darkest soul can be saved. Subscribe to see how a broken flower stopped a bullet, because sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who finally has something to lose. Malphas Vane didn't pull the trigger. The cold rain, which had felt like an invitation to the grave only moments ago, now felt like an intrusion on a singular, impossible reality. He looked down at the small, wet hand still gripping his cashmere sleeve, then at the wilted marigold held aloft like a holy relic. The girl couldn't have been more than 3. Her face was a map of smudges and dried salt from old tears, and her coat was 3 sizes too large, held together by a safety pin that looked ready to give way. Malphas felt a phantom ache in his chest, not the sharp sting of the bullets he had survived, but a dull, heavy throb he hadn't felt since he was a boy standing in the ruins of his own life. He didn't speak. Men like him had forgotten how to talk to the innocent. Instead, he slowly lowered the weapon, the metal heavy and shameful in his tattooed grip, and tucked it into the small of his back. He reached out, his large, scarred fingers trembling as they brushed the brittle, brown petals of the flower. The girl didn't flinch. In a city where grown men crossed the street to avoid his shadow, this tiny creature looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only a devastating, quiet expectation. She turned then, her task seemingly complete, and began to trudge away through the darkening park. Malphas should have stayed on that bench. He should have let the darkness take him, as he had planned. But the weight of the wilted flower, now clutched in his own hand, acted as a lead weight, pulling him off the seat and onto the pavement behind her. He followed at a distance, a wolf stalking a lamb through the gray fog of Manhattan. He watched as she navigated the treacherous currents of the city with a practiced, heartbreaking caution. She didn't look for a mother's hand at the crosswalks. She simply waited for the lights to change, her small head bowed against the wind. Malphas felt a mounting rage, a heat that began to melt the ice in his veins. Where was the woman who should be frantic with worry? Where was the father who should be scouring these streets? The journey led them out of the manicured paths of the park and into the jagged edges of the North End, a place Malphas knew too well. This was his kingdom, a labyrinth of crumbling brick and broken promises. The girl turned into a narrow alleyway choked with the skeletons of discarded furniture and the stench of neglect. She stopped in front of a rusted service door belonging to a condemned warehouse, a building Malphas' own Syndicate used to use for disposals. He watched from the shadows as she struggled with the heavy door, her small boots slipping on the slick grime until it groaned open just enough for her to vanish inside. Malphas moved with the silent efficiency of a predator slipping through the gap behind her. The interior was a cavern of rotting timber and freezing drafts. There was no light save for the sickly orange glow of a distant street lamp filtering through a cracked skylight. In the corner, beneath a lean-to made of stolen plywood and plastic sheeting, the girl sat down. She didn't call out for anyone. There was no "Mama, I'm home." There was only the sound of a toddler struggling to unzip a sodden jacket with frozen fingers. Malphas stood in the center of the vast, hollow space, his breath hitching in the cold. He looked around the home she had built. A pile of rags served as a bed. A plastic crate held a single, cracked bowl and a half-eaten crust of bread that was surely turning to stone. There were no toys, no warmth, and most importantly, no other soul. He realized then, with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, that the girl with no name was truly, utterly alone. She wasn't a child who had wandered off. She was a ghost inhabiting a world that had forgotten to claim her. She crawled onto the pile of rags, curling into a tight ball, and shivering so violently he could hear her teeth chatter from 10 feet away. Malphas Vane, the man who had ordered the burning of entire blocks, felt his knees go weak. He looked at the wilted marigold in his hand, and then at the shivering girl. He had spent his life creating orphans, and now, at the end of his rope, the universe had handed him the very masterpiece of his own cruelty to hold. The Hollow King was no longer looking for a way out. As he watched her small chest rise and fall in the freezing dark, he knew his final act wouldn't be a bullet to his own head. It would be a war against the very world that had left her here. The heavy, iron door of the warehouse groaned as Malphas Vane stepped back into the biting night. The image of the girl huddled among rags burned into his retinas like a brand. He walked with a new, frantic energy, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the rain-slicked pavement. He didn't head for his penthouse or his usual haunts where the liquor was top shelf and the company was curated by fear. Instead, he sought out a small, 24-hour diner on the edge of the North End, a place where the steam on the windows hid the faces of the desperate. The bell above the door chimed a lonely note as he entered, the smell of grease and burnt coffee hitting him like a physical blow. The waitress, a woman with eyes that had seen too many midnight shifts, froze when she recognized the sharp, tattooed silhouette of the man they called the Hollow King. Malphas didn't offer a greeting. He simply pointed to the menu and ordered a heavy meal of chicken, mashed potatoes, and a side of warm bread, insisting it be packed in a way that would retain its heat. He watched her hands tremble as she bagged the food, but his mind was already back in that freezing warehouse, wondering if a 3-year-old's heart could actually stop from the sheer weight of the cold. When he returned to the alleyway, the black sedan he had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of being watched. He ignored the prickle on the back of his neck and slipped back inside the cavernous ruin. Elara hadn't moved. She was a small, shivering knot of misery under the plastic sheeting. Malphas knelt beside her, the movement awkward for a man who usually stood tall to intimidate. He opened the container, and the steam rose in a fragrant cloud, momentarily masking the scent of rot and damp wood. Elara's eyes snapped open, wide and glassy with the onset of fever, yet they locked onto the food with a primal intensity. She didn't reach for it. She looked at Malphas as if waiting for the catch, for the blow that usually followed a gift. He tore off a piece of the warm bread and held it out, his large, scarred hand appearing monstrous next to her tiny, translucent face. She took it tentatively, her small teeth tearing into the soft dough with a desperation that made Malphas's own stomach churn with a sudden, localized grief. As she ate, the color began to return to her cheeks, a faint pink bloom against the gray pallor of the North End. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a high-rise office that smelled of expensive cigars and cold ambition, Silvio sat behind a desk of polished obsidian. He tapped a gold ring against the glass, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. 2 of his best trackers stood before him, their heads bowed. Malphas Vane, the Syndicate's most reliable instrument of terror, had missed 3 check-ins. In their world, absence was never just absence. It was a declaration of war or a sign of terminal weakness. Silvio looked at a digital map of the city, the red dot representing Malphas's encrypted phone stationary for far too long in a district that held no strategic value. The Syndicate functioned on the absolute predictability of its monsters, and the Hollow King had suddenly become a variable they couldn't control. Silvio didn't believe in miracles or sudden changes of heart. He believed in leverage and the inevitable rot of sentiment. He issued a quiet command, a low murmur that set the gears of a hunt in motion, targeting the very district where Malphas was currently watching a child lick gravy from her fingers. Back in the warehouse, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of a life being sustained. Elara had finished the meal, her breathing slowing as the warmth of the food finally began to win the battle against the ambient chill. She looked at Malphas, her small hand reaching out to touch the heavy wool of his overcoat. For the first time, Malphas didn't feel like a weapon. He felt like a wall, a barrier between this fragile flame and the hurricane he knew was coming. He knew the Syndicate's protocols. He knew that by now, Silvio would have teams moving through the North End like a fever through a terminal patient. He looked at the girl, then at the wilted marigold he had tucked into his breast pocket. He had spent 15 years building a kingdom of shadows, and in a single hour, a child with no name had convinced him to burn it all down just for the chance to see her sleep without shivering. He stood up, the shadows of the warehouse lengthening around him, and began to plan a defense for a life he had only just decided was worth saving. The heavy silence of the warehouse was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden shift in the air that Malphas Vane felt in the marrow of his bones. He had spent a decade as the Syndicate's primary instrument of dread, and he knew the precise frequency of a professional hunt. Across the vast, shadow-drenched floor, the infrared beam of a tactical light cut through the freezing fog, a thin red needle stitching through the darkness toward the plywood lean-to where Elara lay. Malphas moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that belied his massive frame, scooping the child into his arms before the light could find her. She let out a small, confused whimper, but he pressed a large, calloused palm over her mouth, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that commanded a silence only the truly terrified could achieve. He retreated into the deeper gloom of the loading docks, the child a small, warm weight against his chest that made his heart beat with a frantic, unpracticed rhythm. He could hear them now, the soft scuff of tactical boots on rotted timber and the rhythmic click of safety catches being disengaged. Silvio hadn't sent messengers. He had sent cleaners, men Malphas had trained himself, men who knew that in the architecture of power, there was no room for a king who had lost his crown to a toddler's whim. The lead scout stepped into the pale amber light of the cracked skylight, his silhouette sharp and lethal. Malphas watched from the darkness, his hand sliding to the .45 tucked into his waistband, the metal no longer a tool of surrender but a barrier of protection. The realization hit him with the force of an avalanche. He couldn't just hide, and he couldn't just run. If he stayed in the shadows, they would eventually find the rags, the plastic crate, and the scent of the warm meal he had just provided. They would track her like a wounded animal until the North End ran red. To save the girl with no name, the Hollow King had to return to the throne of violence he had tried to vacate only hours before. He carefully placed Elara behind a stack of rusted iron pipes, whispering a single guttural command to stay down, his voice cracking with an emotion he didn't have a name for. As he stepped out into the open, the predatory grace of his movements returned, the tattoos on his arms appearing like ancient war paint under the flickering industrial lights. The scouts froze, their weapons snapping toward the center of the room. They recognized the man they were sent to kill, the legend whose name was whispered in every dark corner of the city as a synonym for death. But they didn't see the broken man from the park bench. They saw a version of Malphas Vane that was infinitely more dangerous because he finally had a reason to fight that wasn't born of malice. The first shot rang out, a deafening crack that echoed through the hollow warehouse like a thunderclap, the bullet whistling past Malphas's ear to bury itself in the rotted wood behind him. He didn't flinch. He returned fire with a surgical precision, the muzzle flash illuminating the grim set of his jaw and the terrifying focus in his gray eyes. He moved through the warehouse like a ghost, using the familiar terrain of his old disposal ground to turn the hunters into the hunted. Each movement was calculated, each pull of the trigger a desperate prayer for the child shivering behind the iron pipes. He wasn't fighting for territory or for Silvio's approval. He was fighting for a world where a wilted flower could actually mean something. By the time the last scout fell into the silence, the air in the warehouse was thick with the scent of gunpowder and ozone. Malphas stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his hand trembling as he lowered the weapon. He looked toward the iron pipes, and for a terrifying second, he was afraid she was gone, that the violence had swallowed her whole. But then, a small, curly head peeked out from behind the rust, her eyes wide and searching. She didn't look at the bodies or the blood. She looked at Malphas, her small hand reaching out for the man who had just dismantled a world to keep her safe. He crossed the floor in 3 strides, gathering her up and burying his face in her hair, the smell of milk and talc grounding him in a way no victory ever had. He knew this was only the beginning. Silvio would send more, and the Syndicate would never stop until the threat of Malphas's humanity was neutralized. He looked at the exit, the rain still lashing against the rusted steel, and knew they couldn't stay. To keep the girl with no name alive, he would have to lead her directly into the heart of the storm. Malphas Vane carried the child through the skeletal remains of the warehouse district, his long, heavy strides cutting through the freezing mist that had descended over the north end. Every shadow felt like a predatory eye, every distant siren a herald of Silvio's reaching grasp. The weight of Elara against his chest was a constant, searing reminder of the life he had suddenly claimed responsibility for, a life so fragile that his own tattooed hands felt clumsy and dangerous just holding her. He knew he couldn't stay in the ruins. The scent of gunpowder still clung to his wool coat, a trail of breadcrumbs for the Syndicate's hounds. He had spent 15 years building a fortress of fear. Yet, as he looked at the toddler's small, pale face illuminated by the flickering street lamps, he realized he didn't have a single place in this city where she would truly be safe. His first instinct was the old safe house on 4th and Main, a reinforced apartment with a steel core door and a hidden exit that only he and Nico had known about. It was meant for a man hiding from assassins, not a girl hiding from the world, but it was the only sanctuary he had left to offer. When they reached the nondescript brick building, Malphas didn't use the elevator. He took the back stairs, his ears tuned to the frequency of footsteps that shouldn't be there. Inside the apartment, the air was stale and smelled of gun oil and forgotten rain. He set Elara down on a moth-eaten sofa, the springs groaning under even her feather-light weight. The room was cold, lit only by the neon hum of a liquor sign from across the street, casting rhythmic bars of red and blue light across her face. Malphas moved through the space with a frantic, mechanical efficiency, checking the perimeter and reinforcing the locks. He had promised himself, and perhaps whatever god was still listening, that he would keep her safe. But as he looked at her sitting there, clutching the wilted marigold in one hand and the one-eyed stuffed rabbit he had scavenged from the warehouse in the other, a jagged truth began to pierce through his resolve. To stay with her was to paint a target on her back. Silvio wouldn't stop until Malphas was dead, and anyone near him was just acceptable collateral. He knelt before the sofa, the movement feeling like a prayer he didn't know the words to. He told her he had to go, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that felt too loud in the cramped silence. He tried to explain that a woman he trusted, a former associate who owed him a life, would come for her in the morning, that she would take her somewhere with grass and sunlight, far away from the iron and ash of the North End. He promised her she would have warm meals and a bed that didn't smell of rot. But as he spoke the words, Elara's eyes, those wide, ancient eyes that had seen the worst of the city, began to fill with a devastating clarity. She didn't understand the logistics of a Mafia war, but she understood the tone of a goodbye. She dropped the wilted flower, the brittle petals scattering across the floor like shards of a broken heart, and reached for his sleeve with a desperate, trembling strength. The sound that followed was a high, thin wail that tore through the stagnant air of the safe house, a cry that mirrored the exact frequency of Malphas's own childhood abandonment. It was the sound of a soul realizing it was being discarded once again. Malphas froze, the memory of a cold kitchen and a father who never came home slamming into him with the force of a physical blow. He saw himself in her, a ghost in the making, a child being told that the only person who had ever looked at them with kindness was now walking away. He had built his entire life on the belief that he was a weapon, a tool meant to be used and then put aside, but the sound of her crying shattered the last of that delusion. He realized that leaving her wasn't an act of protection, it was an act of betrayal. He was trying to save her from his world by giving her a life of empty safety, forgetting that the only thing she truly possessed was the man who had picked her up out of the dirt. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, the force of her small, racking sobs vibrating against his chest. The Hollow King, let his own forehead rest against her small shoulder, the tears he hadn't shed in 22 years finally blurring his vision. He had promised she would be safe, but now he made a new, more dangerous promise. He wouldn't leave. He would stand between her and the Syndicate, between her and the darkness, until there was nothing left of him but dust. He picked up the scattered petals of the wilted marigold, tucking them back into his pocket next to his heart. The plan for the grass and the sunlight was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a war he would have to win at any cost. He sat on the floor with his back against the steel core door, the child finally falling into a fitful sleep in his lap, and watched the red and blue lights of the city pulse like a heartbeat he was finally starting to feel. He was no longer a man with nothing to lose. He was a man who had found his Luna in the dark, and he would burn the city to the ground before he let the shadows touch her again. The safe house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a ticking clock encased in brick and mortar. Malphas Vane sat on the floor, the cold weight of the 45 resting near his hand, watching the erratic pulse of the neon liquor sign dance across Elara's sleeping features. Every few seconds, the room would turn a bruised arterial red, then a frozen electric blue. In those flashes of light, Malphas saw the reality of their situation with a clarity that no bullet could provide. He had killed the scouts in the warehouse, but in the architecture of the Syndicate, those men were merely sensors, nerve endings that had sent a final, desperate signal back to the brain. Silvio knew. He didn't just know that Malphas was alive. He knew Malphas had found a heartbeat in the ruins of the North End. For a man like Silvio, who viewed human connection as a terminal illness, this wasn't just a betrayal of the family. It was a perversion of the order Malphas had helped build. The shadows of the city seemed to grow teeth. By dawn, the digital underworld of Manhattan was already humming with a new, lethal data point. Silvio hadn't sent a second wave of soldiers. He had done something far more efficient and far more cruel. He had issued a glass contract on Malphas Vane and the child. In the dark corners of the city, where loyalty was measured in stacks of non-sequential bills, every low-level runner, every corrupt beat cop, and every desperate hitman now had their eyes tuned to the frequency of a man with silver-inked tattoos and a toddler in a tattered coat. The bounty was large enough to retire on, a sum so staggering that it turned the entire population of the city into a collective predator. Malphas looked at Elara, who was stirring in her sleep, her small hands still clutching the hem of his wool coat. He realized that the North End was no longer his kingdom. It was a cage, and the door was being welded shut from the outside. Silvio sat in his obsidian glass office, watching the sunrise bleed over the East River, his face a mask of calculated indifference. He had spent the morning reviewing the dossiers Malphas had left behind, searching for any scrap of sentiment he might have missed. He didn't understand the why, and he didn't care to. To Silvio, Malphas was a high-performance engine that had suddenly begun to seize. If the machine couldn't be fixed, it had to be scrapped so thoroughly that not a single gear remained. He had authorized the use of the Strays, a group of independent trackers who operated outside the family's standard rules. They were men who didn't care about the Hollow King's legend. They only cared about the number of zeros on the wire transfer. Silvio wanted the child brought to him, not because he had a use for her, but because he wanted Malphas to watch the light go out before he followed it into the dark. Malphas felt the shift in the city's atmosphere before he saw it. As he moved Elara toward the fire escape, he saw the way the people on the street below were moving. They weren't just walking, they were scanning. A delivery driver paused a beat too long looking at the safe house windows. A group of men at the corner were passing a phone around, their eyes darting toward the alleyway. The shadow of the Syndicate was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of eyes that made every breath feel like a gamble. He tucked Elara into a makeshift sling against his chest, her small heart beating a frantic staccato against his own. He whispered into her hair, a low, guttural promise that he would get her out, though his own mind was already mapping out the impossible odds of their escape. He led her through the subterranean veins of the city, the abandoned subway tunnels where the air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient damp. He knew the strays would be waiting at the standard exits, their scopes trained on the light. To stay ahead of the bounty, Malphas had to go where even the Syndicate feared to tread, the dead zones where the maps ended and the concrete began to crumble into the earth. He looked at the wilted marigold petals he had collected, now kept in a small glass vial he'd found in the safe house. They were his only compass now. The world had put a price on their heads, transforming his legendary status into a target, but Malphas Vane found he didn't care about the money or the power anymore. He was no longer the Hollow King. He was a man holding a child in the dark, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the shadows. He was the one who was going to make the shadows bleed. The damp, recycled air of the maintenance tunnels felt like a weight against Malphas Vane's lungs as he navigated the labyrinth of rusted pipes and humming electricity. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace, the toddler strapped to his chest in a makeshift harness of stolen linen and industrial tape. Elara was silent, her small head resting against the rough wool of his coat, her eyes reflecting the rhythmic flicker of the distant emergency lights. They were deep beneath the city's surface, in the dead zones where the Syndicate's standard reach usually faltered, yet the shadow of the bounty felt more suffocating than the tons of concrete above them. Malphas felt a jagged, cold sensation in his gut, the realization that his entire identity, the legend of the Hollow King, had been reduced to a dollar amount that turned every soul in Manhattan into a potential executioner. He had spent 15 years viewing people as variables, assets, or obstacles, but now he was the variable being solved for a profit. They emerged into a forgotten subway station, a cavernous tomb of white tile and iron where the tracks ended in a wall of collapsed rubble. It was a place where the city had simply stopped trying. Amidst the decay and the smell of ancient ozone, a massive pile of urban refuse had accumulated beneath a wide ventilation grate. To Malphas, it was a graveyard of utility, broken crates, discarded plastics, and the sodden remains of a world that had moved on. He sat on a rusted bench to adjust the harness, his hand instinctively sliding to the cold grip of his 45, scanning the darkness for the infrared glint of the strays. He was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that made his silver ink tattoos feel like lead weights. He looked at the trash heap and saw only the inevitable rot of his own life, a collection of broken parts waiting to be buried. But Elara saw something else. As he set her down for a moment to stretch his aching back, she didn't shrink away from the gloom. She wandered toward the edge of the refuse pile, her small boots crunching on the gravel. Amidst the gray and the brown of the debris, she found a splash of vibrant, impossible color. It was a discarded bouquet of plastic flowers, their petals faded and caked in city soot, tangled in a web of discarded wire and old newspapers. To any other eye, it was trash, a cheap, synthetic imitation of life that had failed to even biodegrade. But Elara reached out, her small fingers disentangling the flowers from the grime with a reverence that made Malphas's breath catch in his throat. She held them up to the dim, orange light of the tunnel, her face lighting up with a pure, untainted joy. She didn't see the filth or the fact that they were fake. She saw beauty where there was none. She walked back to Malphas, her eyes wide and proud, and placed the plastic bouquet into his large, calloused hand, right next to the glass vial containing the brittle petals of the original marigold. She whispered a single word, a soft, breathy sound that vibrated through the hollow station. Pretty. Malphas looked down at the trash in his hand, then at the girl who had found it. The language of flowers he had known was one of funerals and formal apologies, the expensive, curated arrangements Silvio sent to the widows of the men Malphas had disposed of. But this was different. This was the language of the discarded, the belief that even in the heart of a landfill, there was a spark of something worth holding on to. The realization hit Malphas with the force of a physical blow, shifting his perspective on the war he was fighting. He had been viewing himself as a weapon trying to save a victim, a monster trying to delay the inevitable. But Elara was showing him that he wasn't just a monster in a cage, he was someone who could still see the light if he chose to look for it. He realized that the bounty, the Syndicate, and the Hollow King were all parts of the trash heap he was standing on. They were the discarded elements of a world that valued power over presence. He tucked the plastic flowers into the harness next to her heart, his tattooed hand lingering for a second against her warmth. He wasn't just protecting a girl anymore. He was protecting the only part of himself that still knew how to see the pretty in the dark. He stood up, his gaze hardening as he looked toward the surface. He was no longer running just to survive. He was moving toward a version of himself that was no longer hollow. The bounty was a price on his head, but Elara had given him a value that no amount of Silvio's money could ever buy. He gathered her back into the harness, his heart beating with a new, quiet resolve, and stepped back into the shadows, ready to lead them through the rot toward the morning. Malphas Vane moved through the humid, lightless veins of the lower city with the mechanical precision of a man who had long ago traded his soul for survival. The weight of Elara against his chest was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth, her steady, rhythmic heartbeat, a stark contrast to the hollow drumming in his own ribs. They had reached the Iron District, a skeletal landscape of rusted refineries and abandoned foundry works where the air tasted of ancient soot and chemical rot. This was the domain of Nico, a man Malphas had once pulled from a gutter in Red Hook and forged into his most trusted lieutenant. For 15 years, they had shared bread and blood, and in the unspoken code of the Syndicate, Nico was the only brother Malphas had ever known. If there was a single square inch of Manhattan where the bounty shouldn't reach, it was the fortified basement of Nico's scrapyard. Malphas shifted the harness, his hand grazing the plastic flowers Elara had found, and felt a flicker of something that resembled hope, a dangerous, fragile emotion he hadn't possessed since the night of the wilted marigold. The scrapyard was a fortress of twisted metal and jagged machinery, a graveyard of the city's industrial past that Nico had turned into a lucrative hub for the Syndicate's untraceable logistics. Malphas entered through the rear gate, the code still etched into his mind despite the fog of exhaustion. He found Nico in the back office, the man's face a map of old scars and new anxieties. When Nico saw Malphas, he didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a bottle of cheap whiskey, his hands shaking as he poured 2 glasses. They sat in the dim glow of a single hanging bulb, the silence between them heavy with the weight of the glass contract that now defined Malphas's existence. Nico looked at Elara, who was watching a moth circle the bulb with wide, curious eyes, and then at the silver-inked tattoos on Malphas's arms. He spoke of the shadow of the Syndicate, of how Silvio had turned every corner of the city into an eye, and how the bounty had turned the very air into a poison. Malphas listened, his guard slowly lowering as he recognized the familiar cadence of a man he had once died for in a warehouse in Queens. But as the night deepened, the air in the cramped office began to curdle. Malphas noticed the way Nico's eyes kept darting toward the security monitors, and the way he checked his phone every 3 minutes, the blue light of the screen reflecting a cold, calculated desperation in his gaze. The betrayal didn't arrive with a shout or a gunshot. It arrived with a Judas kiss, a hand on Malphas's shoulder, and a promise of a clean exit through the tunnels under the foundry. Nico told him he had a boat waiting at the pier, a way out of the cage that Silvio had built. He spoke with a conviction that made Malphas want to believe him, but as they stood to leave, the door to the office didn't open from the inside. It was kicked in from the hall, and the orange glow of tactical flares flooded the room, illuminating the cold, predatory faces of the strays. Malphas didn't look at the hunters, he looked at Nico. The man who had been his brother was now standing 3 steps back, his face a mask of shame and greed. The Judas kiss was complete. Nico had sold the Hollow King for a number, a sum of zeros that he believed would finally buy him a life out of the gutter. The realization was a blade in Malphas's gut, sharper than any betrayal Silvio could ever devise. He had been so focused on the beauty Elara had found in the trash that he had forgotten that some rot goes all the way to the bone. He didn't waste breath on words. He gathered Elara into the crook of his arm, his body twisting as he dove behind the heavy oak desk, just as the first volley of gunfire tore through the office. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical roar that shredded the documents and the whiskey bottles, the glass showering Malphas like diamond dust in the dark. Nico's voice rose above the din, a frantic, cracking scream, telling the strays to watch the child, to keep her alive for Silvio. It was the final confirmation of the rot. Malphas felt the pretty world Elara had shown him slipping away, replaced by the familiar, lethal coldness of the enforcer he used to be. He reached into the harness, his hand brushing against the plastic pedals, and then he reached for the 45. He didn't fight for Nico anymore, and he didn't fight for the Syndicate. He fought for the girl who had handed him a wilted flower when he was ready to die. As he kicked over the desk and stepped into the fire, his gray eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with the light of a man who had finally realized that some empires deserve to burn. He would get her out, and he would do it over the bodies of every man who thought a child's life was a currency they could spend. The foundry was about to become a furnace, and Malphas Vane was the one who was going to stoke the flames. The air in the Iron District foundry was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and the metallic tang of betrayal as Malphas Vane dove into the shadows of the secondary smelting floor. He moved with a heavy, calculated grace, the toddler strapped to his chest in a harness that now felt like a second skin. Elara was silent, her small hands fisting into his wool coat, her face buried against the rhythmic thrum of his heartbeat. Malphas could feel her trembling, a fine high-frequency vibration that made his own blood boil with a lethal protective heat. Behind them, the office was a shattered ruin of oak and whiskey, but ahead lay a gauntlet of rusted steel and tactical flares. The strays were closing in, their movements synchronized and professional, their tactical lights cutting through the industrial gloom like scalpels through a wound. Silvio had paid for a clean extraction, but Nico had provided the roadmap to a massacre. Malphas slid behind a massive, rusted casting mold, the metal cold and unyielding against his back. He checked the magazine of the 45, his large, tattooed fingers operating with a mechanical certainty that bypassed the tremor of his adrenaline. He looked down at the child, seeing only the crown of her hair and the tiny, one-eyed rabbit she still clutched. In the distance, he heard Nico's voice, a frantic, cracking shriek calling for the hunters to hold their fire until the girl was secured. It was the sound of a man who had already spent his soul and was now trying to negotiate the change. Malphas felt a jagged, cold sensation in his gut, not of fear, but of a final liberating clarity. He was no longer the enforcer for a syndicate. He was the physical shield for a world that Silvio could never understand. The first wave of hunters stepped into the orange glow of the furnace floor. They didn't move like men. They moved like predators, their weapons snapping toward the sound of Malphas's breathing. The shootout was a rhythmic, deafening roar that shattered the stagnant air of the foundry. Bullets whined off the iron molds, showering Malphas in a rain of sparks and lead dust. He didn't fire back blindly. He waited for the rhythm, for the split-second pause between their volleys. When he moved, he didn't just step, he lunged, keeping his back to the attackers whenever possible, twisting his massive frame to ensure that every incoming round would have to pass through his own muscle and bone before it could ever touch the child. He was a human barrier, a fortress of silver-inked skin and iron will, absorbing the impact of the world so that Elara could remain in the dark. He felt the first sting of a grazing shot across his shoulder, followed by the heavy, dull punch of a round catching him in the thigh. He didn't cry out. He simply shifted his weight, using the momentum to swing around a heavy gear assembly and return fire. His shots were surgical, each pull of the trigger a silent oath to the girl who had handed him a wilted flower. He watched the lead hunter fall, the man's tactical light spinning across the ceiling like a dying star. Malphas moved again, his vision beginning to blur at the edges from the searing pain and the sheer exertion of carrying the extra weight of a life. He saw a staircase leading up to the overhead crane, a high, narrow path that would either be their escape or their gallows. He took it 3 steps at a time, his boots clanging against the metal, a beacon for every weapon in the room. Halfway up the gantry, a second volley of fire erupted from the floor below. Malphas felt a searing heat bloom in his side, a heavy impact that nearly threw him over the railing. He gritted his teeth, his fingers digging into the rusted iron until his knuckles turned white. He didn't stop. He leaned over the child, his wide chest a literal canopy of protection, shielding her from the shards of glass and the ricochets that danced across the metal walkway. He could hear Elara finally crying now, a thin, terrified sound that cut through the thunder of the guns and broke something inside him that had stayed whole through 15 years of murder. He wasn't the Hollow King anymore. He was a man who was willing to let the shadows take him as long as the light stayed on her. He reached the top of the crane, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He looked down at the floor, seeing Nico standing near the entrance, a small, insignificant figure in the face of the fire Malphas had stoked. The enforcer didn't aim for the men anymore. He aimed for the overhead fuel lines. 2 shots, perfectly placed, sent a deluge of oil and fire cascading down onto the smelting floor, cutting off the advance of the strays and turning the foundry into a furnace. In the chaos of the rising heat and the screaming of the metal, Malphas gathered Elara closer, his blood staining her tattered coat. He looked toward the skylight, the gray morning light of Brooklyn finally breaking through the smoke. They were alive, and the siege was broken, but the war for her Luna had only just begun. He stepped out onto the roof, the cold wind of the city hitting his wounds like ice, and began the long crawl toward the only thing that mattered, a world where she wouldn't have to hide. The blood on Malphas Vane's wool coat had turned the color of iron as he stood before the obsidian glass doors of Silvio's inner sanctum. He moved with a heavy, labored cadence, each step a testament to the internal wreckage left by the foundry siege. In his arms, Elara was a small, shivering ghost, her face buried in his shoulder, her tiny hands clutching the one-eyed stuffed rabbit as if it were the only anchor left in a world that had tried to drown her. Malphas didn't knock. He didn't need to. The security detail had been bypassed not by force, but by the sheer, terrifying aura of a man who had already accepted his own death. He pushed the doors open, and the scent of expensive cigars and cold ambition hit him like a physical blow, a reminder of the life he had spent 15 years building and only 3 days destroying. Silvio sat behind his desk, the morning light behind him, casting his face into a mask of calculated shadow. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply watched as the Hollow King, bleeding and broken, walked into the center of the room. Malphas didn't waste time on the hollow rituals of the Syndicate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted drive, the black ledger of the Valente Empire, containing every laundered dollar, every bribed official, and every dark secret Silvio had spent decades burying. He set it on the obsidian desk, the click of the plastic against the glass echoing in the high-ceilinged silence. This was the Empire, reduced to a single shard of silicon. Malphas spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like dry leaves on a fresh grave. He didn't ask for mercy, and he didn't ask for a second chance. He demanded a trade. In exchange for the drive and his own permanent disappearance, he wanted Elara's records erased, every digital trace, every birth certificate, every social services file that could ever lead the world back to this child. He wanted her to become a ghost, a girl who had never existed in the eyes of the law or the Syndicate. Silvio leaned forward, the light finally catching the predatory glint in his eyes. He spoke of the shadow of the Syndicate, of how Malphas was throwing away a kingdom for a scrap of sentiment he didn't even understand. He asked why a man who had seen the worst of humanity would believe that a 3-year-old orphan was worth the destruction of everything they had built. Malphas looked at Elara, whose small hand had strayed to the wilted marigold petals he kept in a vial around his neck. He thought of the plastic flowers in the trash and the pretty world she had insisted on seeing despite the rot. He told Silvio that for 15 years he had been a weapon, but the girl had reminded him that even a weapon can choose what it protects. He wasn't trading an empire for a child. He was trading a nightmare for the only real thing he had ever touched. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made the air feel thin. Silvio looked at the drive, then at the man who had once been his most lethal instrument of terror. He realized that Malphas wasn't bluffing. The Hollow King had already burned his bridges. Now he was ready to burn the entire city. Silvio picked up a tablet and began the process of deletion. He watched as the files representing Elara were scrubbed from the encrypted servers, the data packets vanishing into the void. Birth records, medical notes, police sightings. One by one, the girl with no name was truly becoming a blank slate. When the final confirmation flashed on the screen, Silvio slid the drive into a shredder, the mechanical grind sounding like a funeral march for the Valente name. Malphas didn't wait for a goodbye. He gathered Elara closer, his large, tattooed hand shielding her eyes from the man behind the desk. He walked out of the high-rise, through the marble lobby, where the staff shrunk away from his bloodied silhouette and into the gray Brooklyn morning. He had traded his power, his money, and his safety for a child's anonymity. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt the weight of the glass contract finally lift, replaced by a terrifying, liberating void. He was no longer the enforcer, and she was no longer the orphan. They were simply two people standing in the rain, starting a life that had no past. Malphas looked at the girl, her eyes wide as she watched a bird take flight from a nearby railing, and realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what the morning would bring. The Empire was ash, but the Luna was finally hers to keep. The passage of 5 years had not erased the scars on Malphas Vane's hands, but it had fundamentally altered the weight they were meant to carry. The silver-ink tattoos that once served as a roadmap of his brutality were now partially obscured by the sleeves of a simple linen shirt, their jagged edges softened by the dappled sunlight of a coastal afternoon. Far from the iron-choked district and the obsidian towers of Manhattan, Malphas stood on a wooden porch overlooking a small, thriving plot of land that the locals knew only as the Garden of Luna. The air here did not taste of ozone or gunpowder. It carried the scent of salt spray and damp earth, a fragrance that felt like a long-overdue absolution. He leaned against the railing, his large frame no longer tensed for a lethal strike, but relaxed into a posture of quiet observation. He watched as Elara, now 7 years old, and glowing with a health that seemed impossible on the night he found her in the warehouse, moved through the rows of flowers with the focused grace of a professional gardener. She was no longer the ghost child in the tattered coat. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her laughter, once a thin and terrified wail, was now a frequent and musical sound that filled the open space. In her hands, she held a tray of young marigold seedlings, their vibrant orange petals a stark and beautiful contrast to the memory of the brown, drooping flower she had handed him on that rain-slicked bench. Malphas reached into his pocket and touched the small glass vial he still wore around his neck, containing the brittle dust of the original wilted flower. It was the seed from which this entire life had grown, the catalyst that had forced the Hollow King to dismantle his own empire and trade a kingdom for a heartbeat. He looked at the rows of vibrant blooms and realized that while he had spent 15 years creating graveyards, he had spent the last 5 learning how to nurture a single fragile spark of hope. Elara knelt in the rich, dark soil, her small hands digging with a confidence that mirrored Malphas's own newfound stability. She didn't look for beauty in the trash anymore. She created it with every seed she planted. She paused to wipe a smudge of dirt from her forehead, her eyes catching Malphas's gaze. There was no fear in those eyes, no recognition of the monster he used to be, only a deep and abiding love for the man who had become her world. Malphas felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun, a slow, steady bloom of peace that he had never expected to survive long enough to experience. He had erased her past in Silvio's office, but in this garden, he was finally writing a future that wasn't dictated by blood or shadows. The Syndicate was a distant ghost now, its power broken by the very enforcer it had trained to be invincible. Silvio was gone. Nico was a memory of rot, and the bounty was a dead data point in a world that Malphas had left behind. He walked down the porch steps, his boots thudding softly on the grass, and joined Elara in the dirt. He didn't offer to take the tray from her. He simply knelt beside her, his large scarred hand, helping her press the soil around a new seedling. Together, they worked in the rhythmic silence of people who no longer needed to hide. He looked at the garden and then at the girl, realizing that the language of flowers was finally complete. It wasn't about the expensive arrangements of the dead, It was about the vibrant, living color of a life that had been saved. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Garden of Luna, Malphas Vane finally understood that the most dangerous man in the room was the one who had finally found peace. The wilted flower was gone, but the garden was eternal, and for the first time in his life, the Hollow King was whole.